Good afternoon, everyone. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, I'm Steve Weitzman. I'm here in my role as director of the CAT Center for Advanced Genetic Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'm delighted to welcome you if you're joining us for the first time, and delighted to welcome you back if you've been attending this series as it's been unfolding over the last few months. Before I introduce our speaker this afternoon, I want to just make a few comments. First, I want to thank our partners and co-sponsors, beginning with Dr. Mira Wasserman, Director of the Center for Jewish Ethics at the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College here in Philadelphia, and the co-organizer of this series. And I also want to thank Penn's Campaign for Community out of its Vice Provost office, the NSF Paideia program from the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the terrific staff at the CAT Center itself, who have made this program possible. Just a brief scheduling note. Next week is, of course, the holiday of Passover. So we will not be having a presentation next Thursday. However, we will be resuming after that for the rest of April. And I want to call your attention to our next presentation, which will be on April 8th, which will be a presentation by a husband-wife team of scholars, Helen Kim and Noah Levitt from Whitman College. They have co-written a book entitled Jew-Asian, Race, Religion, and Identity for America's Newest Jews, and I hope you will return for that program. And finally, just a brief word about how today's program is going to unfold. This is an hour-long program, so we'll be ending promptly at 2:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. As many of you probably know by now, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions in writing. And after our presentation, which will run about 35 minutes, we will have some time for Q&A that will be managed by Dr. Wasserman, along with the Director of Public Programs for the CAT Center, Dr. Ann Albert. So now it is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Professor Judith Weisenfeld, who is the Agat Brown and George L. Collard Professor of Religion and the Chair of the Department of Religion at Princeton University. Professor Weisenfeld is one of the country's foremost scholars of American religious history, with publications that include Hollywood Be Thy Name, African American Religion and American Film from 1929 to 1949, the volume African American Woman and Christian Activism, New York's Black YWCA, 1905-1945, and her most recent book, A New World of Coming, Black Religion and Racial Identity During the Great Migration, which was awarded the 2017 Albert J. Rabatow Prize for the best book in Africana religions. This latter book is how I first encountered Professor Weisenfeld's scholarship, and I want to acknowledge and thank her, because that book really opened my eyes to how race and religion interact to shape identity in American society. And for that and for many other reasons, I'm grateful to her, and grateful to her as well for sharing her insight with us this afternoon. The title of her presentation is We Are the Ethiopian Hebrews, Brothers to the Fair White Jew, Race, Religion, and Jewish Identity in Harlem. Would you please join me in giving her a warm virtual welcome?
Thank you, Steve. I'm honored to be here, and I'm going to share my screen as I get ready. So I am going to speak about some of the research I did for the book. And sorry, I'm just getting my video going right. Okay. So on Sunday, April 26, 1942, Wentworth Arthur Matthew joined hundreds of thousands of men in New York City and millions of men across the country between the ages of 45 and 64 who had been called to appear before their local draft boards that weekend. Matthew handed the paperwork he had completed to a registrar in Harlem, where he lived. An immigrant from St. Kitts in the British West Indies who had become a naturalized citizen in 1928, Matthew provided his name, information about his birth, and contact and employment on the front side of the registration form, which you see here. And the selective service process also required that the registrar respond to several questions printed on the back of the form to describe the man before him or her. And in this instance, Registrar Claire Schwartz noted that Matthew was 5 feet 6 inches tall, weighed 160 pounds, had brown eyes and black hair, and a dark brown complexion. There were 5 options for race on this form: white, Negro, Oriental, Indian, and Filipino, and Schwartz checked Negro. But written in her handwriting in tight script above the printed word Negro is the additional label of Hebrew, inserted at Matthew's request. Now, the surprise of finding this notation while searching for biographical information about Matthew led me to write New World a Coming and to pursue a range of questions about the relationship of race to religion in this context. You may have noticed that he included his clerical title of rabbi on the front of the form, even though it was not required information. And we see clearly that his religious affiliation was important to him. But I wondered here then if Matthew understood Hebrew to be primarily a racial designator, an approach that has had a complicated history for Jews of European descent in the United States, or if Hebrew designated both race and religion to him in ways that defied the accepted racial labels of the day, particularly when it came to those classified by the state as Negroes. We can never recover the details of the bureaucratic and interpersonal transaction between Matthew and the registrar Claire Schwartz, who may herself have been Jewish, that led to the amendment of government-supplied racial designators and government-authorized racial designators. We do know from the archival record that Matthew was by no means the only registrant who would ordinarily have been designated Negro to insist that the category could not capture accurately his self-understanding and identity. Indeed, once I stumbled on this and started searching for more cases like this, I found that that there are hundreds of such cases among the draft registration cards that are available for research. And they took a variety of forms. In some cases, immigrants of African descent from the Caribbean and Central America rejected the category of Negro as an American creation, and to them, one that was necessarily demeaning. And they opted instead to talk about themselves in terms of place of origin. And so in those cases, working within the bounds of the options provided, many modified the supplied category of Indian to designate themselves West Indian, and sometimes with even finer details like distinctions like British or Danish West Indian. And you see one example here of an immigrant from Grenada who declares himself West Indian. But what Matthew and others I'm interested in, who themselves represent many more men and women in their families and communities who are not called to the selective service process, what they hope to accomplish in insisting on self-representation during the draft registration process was something different from this sort of modification you see here. The most striking thing about their draft registration assertions is that they were aimed not only at racial classification, but were also meant to link religious and racial identity. And in my book, I examined several Black religious movements that emerged in northern cities in the context of significant demographic changes of the early 20th century that generated questions in Black communities about religious and racial identity. The first decades of the 20th century saw the immigration of more than 100,000 people of African descent from the Caribbean, mostly the British West Indies, and also the migration of millions of Southern African Americans to the urban North in a movement scholars refer to as the Great Migration, all in search of greater economic, political, and social opportunity, and for Black migrants from the South, relief from the oppressive structures of legal segregation and the racial terrorism that accompanied and enforced it. These migrations transformed northern cities through dramatic increases in the percentage of Black residents who created vibrant cities within cities. Black migrants and immigrants also transformed the cultural landscape of northern cities, and their creativity and spiritual questing produced new religious options. So in this period, And in these urban contexts, people of African descent established and joined movements outside of the dominant Protestantism of Black communities, movements such as the Moorish Science Temple, founded in Chicago and whose members embraced and promoted Moorish Muslim identity. Father Divine's Peace Mission, headquartered in Harlem and then later in Philadelphia, and whose followers recognized him, you see on the right, as the God of the Bible in a body, and rejected race as the creation of the devil. The Nation of Islam, founded in Detroit by W.D. Farad and Elijah Muhammad, who you see pictured here, with a theology that posited what they called the Asiatic Black man as the original inhabitant of the earth, and also Black Hebrew congregations in Harlem and several other cities. Now, adherents in all of these groups turned for spiritual sustenance to theologies that provided new ways of thinking about sacred history and geography, racial identity, ritual life, community structures, and politics. And I came to describe these as religio-racial movements to highlight how, in rejecting ascribed Negro racial classification and Protestant affiliation, founders and members insisted on the inseparability of racial and religious identity, both individual and collective. By the time Matthew completed the draft registration process in 1946, 2 decades after this religious creativity began to develop in the Great Migration, he was arguably the most prominent and influential Ethiopian Hebrew in the United States, and the Commandment Keepers congregation he led in Harlem, which began as a church, represented an important and growing community whose members articulated a collective Black Jewishness. Wentworth Matthews' Commandment Keepers and several other early 20th century congregations formulated Black Hebrew identities, navigating relationships to the Jewishness of Jews of European descent, who are sometimes their neighbors, relationships to the majority Black Protestant congregations around them, and to American Christian white supremacy. In my book, I argue that it's essential that we understand the emergence of communities I group under the heading of Ethiopian Hebrew congregations as concerning themselves with both race and religion, and speaking from and to a particular moment of US religious and racial history. So while an encounter of a type we have come to talk about in terms of Black-Jewish relations shaped the world of these Ethiopian Hebrew congregations, the modes of Black Jewishness they formulated in part through engagement with the practices and cultures of Jews of European descent were also directed at reshaping the worlds and self-understandings of Black people who these Ethiopian Hebrews argued were laboring under the mistaken belief that they were racially Negro and that Christianity was an appropriate religion for them. You're probably aware of current groups in the US that are generally described as Black Hebrew Israelites, as well as others like the African Hebrew Israelites of Jerusalem based in Dimona, and that group was founded in the US by African Americans. These groups are from a later generation than the groups on which I'll focus briefly today. So one important takeaway today is that there's no singular Black Hebrew, Ethiopian Hebrew, Black Israelite group. Indeed, there are others that predate the ones I'll talk about, and that understanding the different histories, beliefs, political postures, the relationship to Jews of European descent and relationship to the United States is an important part of this story. In addition, my attention to this history and these groups as representing one strand of Black Judaism does not include Jews of African descent at the time who came to Jewishness through different routes and were not affiliated with these Ethiopian Hebrew congregations. For example, Rufus L. Perry, a prominent lawyer in Brooklyn and the son of a well-known Baptist minister and journal editor, converted to Judaism in 1912, and while not likely the first Black Jew, as the headline here contends, or even Black convert in America, Perry brought attention to the possibility that such a thing as a Negro Jew could exist. But for him, this was an individual choice and did not necessarily speak to larger issues about race and religion for Black people, which is what I see the Ethiopian Hebrew congregations of this era doing. So in my work, I've been interested in what the emergence of congregations whose members embraced Ethiopian Hebrew identity in the changing cultural landscape of the early 20th century urban North reveals about the meanings Blacks in America made of the relationship of race to religion in an era marked by the racial strictures of segregation, the violence of racial terrorism, the prominence of eugenics, the passage of the 1924 Johnson-Reed Immigration Act, as well as the political, cultural, and religious flowering in Black communities at the time. The assertion of Ethiopian Hebrew identity in this period was not only a rejection of an identity adherents found to be false, that is, Negro, but the promotion of a Black Jewishness they saw as divine affirmation of their individual and collective humanity and history in ways they felt Christianity could not provide. Their understandings of Black Jewishness as Ethiopian Hebrew, which they figured in a variety of ways, which I'll talk about in a minute, was not a ruse to gain credibility with Jews of European descent, as one commentator argued recently, but spoke to a longer history of African diaspora peoples' religious meaning-making through biblical Ethiopia as representative of Africa. Psalm 68:31, princes shall come out of Egypt, and Ethiopia shall soon stretch forth her hands unto God, was a rich text for religious charting of possible Black futures in the wake of slavery. And while early 20th century Ethiopian Hebrews in the US claimed connections to Ethiopian Jewish history, they did not present themselves as part of the Beta Israel, commonly referred to at the time as falashas. So to understand how they connected race and religion within Jewishness, we need to look to broader currents in early 20th century Black Atlantic life. The Universal Negro Improvement Association, founded by Jamaican immigrant Marcus Garvey, was an incubator for the groups I link under the umbrella of Ethiopian Hebrew congregations, and indeed some of the other religio-racial groups I talk about in the book. And the UNI's influence accounts in part for the prominence of Afro-Caribbean immigrants in the Ethiopian Hebrew movement. Garvey arrived in the US in 1916 and established the group's headquarters in Harlem, developing the UNIA into a movement with 700 branches in 38 states and more than 200 across the African diaspora. Garvey proclaimed that Blacks were a transnational, global, connected people, and he promoted a Black nationalism under the corporate banner of Negro, as we see in the title of the organization's newspaper, The Negro World. The UNIA's work focused in part on reclaiming Africa as a spiritual and political homeland, and its motto, one God, one aim, one destiny, articulated the grand scale of members' goals. Garvey labored both rhetorically and materially to achieve this end, calling on people of African descent to learn of their race's glorious history, to dispel what he called the inferiority illusion, and to work together through the UNIA to create a strong and united Negro world. Arnold Josiah Ford, an immigrant to New York from Barbados, had been active in Garvey's movement, and he served as the UNIA's musical director and composed some of the hymns and anthems members sang at meetings, which he later published along with others in the Universal Ethiopian Hymnal. Ford, along with a group of fellow Garveyites, came to believe in a literal connection between Black people and the biblical Hebrews, with Africa as the place where that history began. They formed a study group at the UNIA's Liberty Hall in Harlem and eventually founded two congregations, Ford's congregation Beth B'nai Abraham and Mordecai Herman's Moorish Zionist temple. And these leaders, along with Wentworth Matthew, offered followers a variety of ways of understanding their identity as Ethiopian Hebrews. Not surprisingly, the starting point for embrace of Ethiopian Hebrew identity was the Bible, and in ways that were mindful of the significance of the Exodus narrative to Africans enslaved in the Americas, but that did more than liken themselves to the biblical Israelites through structural similarities or metaphorical connections. They read biblical and apocryphal texts like Esther and Second Esdras to formulate a history of Ethiopian Hebrews. Some understood themselves as connected to the lost tribes, maintaining Israelite identity in Africa, and others argued that Ethiopian Hebrews, as distinct from other Ethiopians, had been part of Abraham's tribe in biblical times. Some narratives of Ethiopian Hebrew identity drew on the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba to argue, as did Mordecai Herman, Ford's partner in founding congregation Beth B'nai Abraham, that Africa and Israel were once united and that, quote, Jewry is from the first born in Africa and therefore is the whole of Africa Jewish, end quote. In formulating what they understood to be their true religio-racial identity around a connection to a place that gave them peoplehood, a peoplehood and a history different from that forced on them in slavery, members of Ethiopian Hebrew congregations pursued a strategy similar to those in another religio-racial movement, the Moorish Science Temple I mentioned earlier, in which members looked to Morocco and the ancient Moabites for their narrative of history and identity. But even as these religious thinkers identified varied connections or historical ties to biblical Israelites, they affirmed a common Ethiopian Hebrew identity. And as E.J. Benson, who was a rabbi ordained by Matthew, asserted, quote, we are not Gentiles, but are the Ethiopian Hebrews, a brother to the fair white Jew who was in color like the Gentiles, end quote. Now, the leaders and members of these congregations were invested deeply in the labels that described their religio-racial heritage. And again, that's something that they have in common with other groups, that labeling what we call ourselves individually and collectively is of profound spiritual importance. They insisted on the use of correct terminology. So Benson's use of the term Hebrew for himself and Jew for his white brother was in keeping with the perspective of many Ethiopian Hebrews that the two terms signified communities that were connected but had divergent histories. Ford considered white Jews to be descended from the Israelites, but saw their whiteness as the result of intermarriage between Ethiopians and Europeans. So thus, for Ford and his followers, the label Jewish was applied appropriately to Jews of European descent, while people of African descent should be referred to as Hebrews. It was equally important for Ford, Benson, Matthew, and other leaders and members in this group that they not be referred to as Negroes. Ford declared, quote, all I recognize by Negro is an African or a person of African descent whose mind is a byproduct of European civilization, but has not traditions of its own. Hebrews are not Negroes, end quote. Similarly, Matthew rejected the label Negro as a badge of slavery and preached, quote, do not submit meekly to being called a Negro, end quote. In this way, the leaders and members of Ethiopian Hebrew congregations joined other religio-racial groups like the Nation of Islam, the Moorish Science Temple, and Father Divine's Peace Mission in understanding language as a tool for religio-racial transformation, and one that had religious, social, and political consequences. In addition to reading biblical texts as confirming their identities as Ethiopian Hebrews and interpreting Jewish history as rooted in Africa, some of the founders and leaders of these congregations invoked their own family histories to understand the connection between biblical Hebrews and those West Africans subjected to slavery in the Atlantic world. These approaches were like those of contemporary ethnologists like the Jesuit Joseph J. Williams, who published a text titled Hebrewisms of West Africa in 1930. By the late 1920s, Ford was also teaching that his followers that Hebrew history began in Nigeria and that Israelites then migrated to Egypt and eventually Palestine. Born in Barbados and baptized a Methodist, Ford linked himself to this narrative through the assertion that his parents had been born or that he had a recent connection to West Africa and Nigeria in particular. Both of his parents were faithful Jews, he contended, and he said once his mother, quote, lived as a Jewess simply by living as an African, end quote. So for Ford, this unbroken history of Jewish practice with African origins, combined with his belief that he descended from the priestly Kohen line, these combined to authorize his religious leadership and status as a rabbi. Matthew, who Ford ordained, also invoked a recent connection to West Africa to authorize his Jewishness, sometimes listing his birthplace as Lagos, Nigeria. And it was a search for these different ways Matthew, or different places of origin in Matthew's history that led me to stumble on that draft card. So these varied ways of authenticating religio-racial identity narratives of Black Jewishness led members of these congregations to speak of themselves not as converts to Judaism, but as discovering a true identity that had been taken from them or hidden from them. Maud MacLeod, an immigrant from Montserrat and a member of Matthew's congregation, insisted, quote, I did not join the Hebrew faith, I returned. I was simply on the wrong road and found my way back, end quote. Now in the book, I expand the scholarly focus on male founders and leaders to consider what it meant for people like Maud MacLeod to return to the Hebrew faith. I was interested in what we might learn in the context of the other religio-racial groups about the approaches members took to individual and collective religio-racial transformation. I considered how, in the early years of the movements, members participated in the creation of religio-racial identities through practices of self-fashioning, including commitment to the new collective religio-racial identity. So thinking about the context in which people were animated, felt it really important to assert that they were Ethiopian Hebrews, as in the case of the draft card, the draft registration process. Expressions like individual name changes, the adoption of new styles of dress. I explore the practices through which members of these groups maintained their religio-racial bodies, such as adopting new approaches to diet, health and healing, and death and burial, all of which they understood to derive from their religio-racial identities. For example, Esther Balfour, who you see on the right here, arrived in the US from Jamaica in 1917. She joined the Commandment Keepers congregation in 1936 and began taking courses in the school's Hebrew department in 1937. Trained in Jamaica as a teacher, in New York, Balfour worked as a finisher in a clothing factory, but as a result of her religious education, she was able to return to the classroom as a teacher in the congregation's Hebrew school. I think also about a figure like Mabel Hager, who was a native of South Carolina, who joined the Commandment Keepers in the early 1940s and described in her will, her wish to be, quote, put away in the true Hebrew fashion in the grounds of the Ethiopian Hebrews at Douglas Memorial Park, end quote. And this is a cemetery in Staten Island that had been founded by Black Harlem funeral directors to, in their words, halt indignities to the Negro dead. In her brief written request kept on file with Rabbi Matthew, Hager asserted, quote, I lived the life of a Jew after I learned who I really was, and I want to be buried as a Jew, end quote. And she also expressed her hope that her husband, who may not have been a member of the congregation, that her husband would abide by her wishes and put her away in the grounds of the Ethiopian Hebrews. So it was in the context of the work of living as Ethiopian Hebrews that members of these congregations engaged Jews of European descent regularly. And so they were a curiosity in New York. And many of the earliest accounts of worship and community life come from reporters, religious leaders, and scholars of European Jewish descent who are interested in learning more about these congregations. Ethiopian Hebrews also turned to Jews of European descent to provide specialized knowledge, such as Hebrew and Yiddish language instruction, and skills for the community, including circumcision and kosher butchery. At the same time, leaders and members of these congregations were clear that they desired to establish Ethiopian Hebrew traditions that distinguished them not only from Jews of European descent, but also from their Black Christian neighbors. And one of the congregation's rabbis is constantly making a call for some young man to take up kosher butchery to help the congregation. The issue of developing appropriate liturgical music became a point of contention in the 1940s for members of Kohol Beth B'nai Yisrael, located on Lenox Avenue near 120th Street. The congregation had been founded by former members of the Commandment Keepers and was led by Rabbi Julius Wilkins, a Harlem native, and also by Jamaican immigrant Ellis McLeod, who was a rabbi in the congregation. The group had long used some hymns of Christian origin, as well as music from Marcus Garvey's UNIA that had been written by Rabbi Arnold Ford. But McLeod wanted, quote, suitable words and music for Ethiopian Hebrews, end quote. And Eudora Paris, who was a native of Danish St. Croix and a vocalist, had been a native of Danish St. Croix and the member he had tasked with this work. Paris had not accomplished what McLeod had asked her to do. She was a vocalist and had been an original member of Ford's congregation, Beth B'nai Abraham. She performed with him at some early fundraising concerts, and she accompanied him to Ethiopia in the early 1930s. But Paris's lack of progress in developing Ethiopian Hebrew music frustrated McLeod's desire to distinguish the congregation from their Black Christian neighbors, and he turned, at least for a time, to the Union hymnal instead. But in this conflict, we see the broader world these communities were navigating in making their religio-racial identity claims and doing the work, again, of living, of enacting this. In the book, I also consider the impact of the embrace of what individuals understood to be their true religio-racial identity on their social worlds of family, community, economy, and nation. The efforts of members of Ethiopian Hebrew congregations to distinguish themselves as Ethiopian Hebrews also led some to consider establishing separate communities, which also connects them to other religio-racial movements in the period engaging in similar strategies. Arnold Ford was so committed to Ethiopian Hebrew identity that in 1930, following the coronation of Haile Selassie as the Ethiopian emperor, led a small group of members of his congregation, again, including Eudora Paris, to Ethiopia to prepare the way for more to go and settle. The group struggled financially, and Ford died in 1935 on the eve of Mussolini's invasion. After Italy invaded Ethiopia, most of Ford's followers returned and continued to contribute to the development and spread of Ethiopian Hebrew identity, particularly under the leadership of Matthew and the rabbis of various affiliated congregations. Eudora Paris returned to the US with an adopted son, Hailu Paris, who would later become a rabbi and lead Mount Horeb congregation in the Bronx, which eventually moved to Laurelton, Queens, which is where I grew up. So I kind of encountered the world of these communities many years later, and was actually not aware of this congregation at the time. While also deeply devoted to Ethiopia and engaged in political activism related to its thriving, Matthew focused on developing the Ethiopian Hebrew identity he and his followers embraced in the context of the United States, expressing a patriotic connection to America, particularly during World War II, and supporting the naturalization of the congregation's Afro-Caribbean immigrant members by offering citizenship classes. At the same time, in the 1940s, they attempted to establish a community to engage in cooperative farming and to live near one another in a new development called Belmont Gardens in Babylon, Long Island. Esther Balfour, the Jamaican immigrant I mentioned earlier, who had become a Hebrew teacher, was among the most devoted to this plan, and she purchased land and constructed a bungalow. But the site never became the center of Ethiopian Hebrew residents, as Matthew and others had envisioned. Nevertheless, this congregation continued to develop in the urban context where they first took hold, or these congregations, and they've persisted in forging an Ethiopian Hebrew religio-racial identity for members who are neither on a path to integrating into Jewish communities in America that have their origins in the immigration of Jews of European descent, nor are they interested in claiming status as the only true Jews, as is the case with many of the more recent Black Hebrew Israelite groups. So to understand how their individual and collective identities as Ethiopian Hebrews took shape, I argue in the book, it is as important to locate them in the broader currents of thought and practice about the relationship of race to religion in early 20th century Black communities in America, as it is to think about them in this kind of trajectory of Black Jewish engagements. So for the largely Afro-Caribbean membership of Ethiopian Hebrew congregations in the first decades of the 20th century, the appeal of membership lay in a narrative of Ethiopian Hebrew identity that offered them a history of peoplehood not grounded in slavery and subjugation, and that rendered them members of God's chosen people. Thank you.
Professor Weisenfeld, thank you so much for just a fascinating presentation. I know people have lots of questions, and I have the honor of just getting us started in conversation with you. I'm really struck by, it comes through in your title and throughout the presentation, this notion of siblinghood or brotherhood with Jews of European descent. And I'm curious if you could, I'm also struck by the connection with European traditions of Yiddish, which are so associated with a particularly European experience. And given that so much of the history unfolds in the 30s and 40s and around World War II, I'm wondering if you found any expressions of solidarity with European Jewry in light of Nazism, or if folks made explicit connections between African nationalisms and Zionism during this period.
Yeah, those are great questions. The Yiddish question is an interesting one, and I see it as in these congregations as especially prominent in the teens and 20s. And I know the recent kind of recovery of the history of Black cantors is also connected in some ways to, I think it's located in some of that early period as well. But there's a period where early on, where in the teens and 20s, there are several more kind of lone figures who present themselves as kind of lone Black Jews who have these interesting stories, and they often demonstrate their Jewishness through the ability to speak Yiddish, and there's a little of that with Ford and Beth B'nai Abraham. I forget, they go to court over, there's a dispute over a Torah, and or fundraising for a Torah for the synagogue, and there's often the kind of, yes, we are Jewish, look, see, we speak Yiddish happens, and you see Yiddish on the concert ad, but that really becomes less important as they begin to get a stronger sense of the African, a stronger and more connected narrative of Ethiopian Hebrew identity. So I see the Yiddish as kind of fading over time. Yes, the World War II era patriotism in U.S. patriotism in the Commandment Keepers is definitely connected to presentation of it's the kind of work we should do both as Americans and Jews, right? So it is in service of something like that. The question of Zionism is interesting and was less prominent than I imagined it would be. I mean, I really limited my time period to right the immediate everything I do. I if it happens after 1950, I'm kind of not that interested in it, but there is, as I followed some of the story into the late 40s and early 50s, I expected there to be a little bit more interest in Palestine and then Israel. There are occasional cases where some of the young couples in the Commandment Keepers go to Israel briefly, but it's not, and may become a bigger, a more prominent interest later. But I was surprised to find a little bit less interest in it than I expected.
Thank you. And I know that Anne is collecting lots of questions and comments from
I
listeners.
see a lot of them there. Thanks.
Turn it over to you, Anne.
Thank you. Yeah, so many wonderful questions, and I must say that there's also just a lot of wonderful feedback in the Q&A. People have been really attentive and really appreciative, so I want to put that out there. So one set of questions that is appearing has to do with just wanting to hear a little bit more about the kind of overall profile of the size and locations of these kinds of groups in the first part of the 20th century. So people are asking, for example, if there were such congregations in the American South, and if not, why not? And with another audience member pointing out that Harlem seems to have been a particular focal point for Black Jewish congregations, not only Ethiopian Hebrews, in the 1920s. And if you could talk a little bit about Harlem as a setting.
Sure. So I said in the beginning that there are groups that predate the ones I'm talking about here. And if you're interested in a history that traces across different kinds of groups that are claiming embracing Israelite or Hebrew identity, Jacob Dorman's Chosen People is a key text for that. And he writes as well about Ford and Matthew. So there are different groups that actually have their origins in the South and the Midwest. The ones I was interested, because I was interested in, my question is what was going on in this period, that there were a lot of groups that were rejecting Negro, Christian, and doing something else. And so these groups are in that larger context I mentioned. And so that is these groups develop in the context of the Great Migration. There's a kind of cultural and spiritual creativity that is the unique product of the migration to the urban context and the immigration of Afro-Caribbean peoples. And so one thing that I did find curious, something I expected, if based on what happened with many of these other groups, is that I imagined then that some of these would do a little bit more work to establish themselves outside of the region of origin. And so the Moore Science Temple has roots in Newark, but it becomes a movement in Chicago. And then, I mean, it has to do, I guess, with whether you are a missionizing group or not, right? Then they send out people to set up, right? So they begin with Southern migrants, and they also have some Afro-Caribbean immigrants, but then they send people back to the South. That doesn't happen. These groups are, but they do propagate other congregations throughout New York, in Philadelphia. E.J. Benson I mentioned is ordained by Matthew, I believe, and he's in Philadelphia. There are parallel groups in Chicago, but it is really the cities of the North, and it's partly because Afro-Caribbean immigrants are the engine of a lot of this, and African-American members join a little bit later. And in terms of numbers, did someone ask about numbers? I don't have numbers, but they're small compared to the still small other groups like the Moore Science Temple, which may have had like 10,000 members. These are small, there's several congregations of a couple of hundred people. So, but this was another interest of mine in the book, that all of the groups I'm interested in often get kind of marginalized because of numbers. So like, well, they really weren't, most everybody remained Protestant, and then there were some Catholics, and then there were these other people. And I was interested in what the publicity of these groups and the performances of these identities and the kinds of claims they made on the nation and other religious groups, what was the impact of that beyond just the question of how many people were in there? And it's just, Matthew was a prominent figure, and as were some of these other rabbis, and the fact that they presented something that was Ethiopian Hebrew identity and leadership and congregations had influenced others to think about whether Negro Christian was a natural combination.
Right, so it sounds like part of what you're saying is that even if the numbers within the congregations were small, they were part of a much bigger intellectual and cultural kind of moment where people were aware of them and hearing about them. And I do have follow-up questions there. Did you want to talk a little bit about Harlem, or do you want to?
Oh, Harlem, yeah. Yeah, Harlem. I wrote my first book about it. I wrote my second book about film images of it in part now. Yeah, Harlem, and then for some of the other groups that I looked at in the New York context, though, led me to think about the Bronx and Brooklyn and Queens as other locations, and not center only Harlem. And one of the commitments I had in the book overall was to not make it a book about New York as much as Harlem is a kind of both an actual and an imaginative center of the universe. It's not so much the case for the Ethiopian Hebrew groups, but I found a bunch of people in the Moore Science Temple living near each other in Toledo, for example. So I wanted to think about the urban as a setting for this work, and Harlem is a cultural center, Chicago as well. But for the Ethiopian Hebrews, Harlem is important, right, because that is one of the primary residential neighborhoods for Black New Yorkers. But it also, of course, puts them in a world of Harlem that's not just Black Harlem, right? That's Jewish Harlem. That's the remnants of white Protestant Harlem. So in that way, I think people often ask me, what did other Muslims in America think about some of these groups that claimed X, Y, and Z? And the reality was that the nation people in the Moore Science Temple were not really likely to come into contact with other people who were Muslim. That's not the case for these groups. So there's a way in which they have to contend with the fact of other Jews in their area. And so there's more, in this period, there's just much more engagement and cooperation and exchange and Harlem is one of the sites where that happens.
Okay, amazing. So you've touched on several of the directions that I want to go based on the questions. in your first set of answers, you mentioned the relationship to immigration from the Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean ancestry, and there are a few questions actually that asked about that, and asked about the impact of that particular cultural background on shaping the religious and intellectual profile of the people who formed these congregations. In general, I think in terms of whether there are aspects of Caribbean religions that are brought forward, and also if there's a racial context in terms of mixed race or race relations in the Caribbean that's being brought in to this scenario.
Yeah, I've thought so much about, and I don't know that I ever came up with a good answer as to why the people who are most likely to join the Moorish Science Temple, for example, were migrants from the South. People most likely to join these Ethiopian Hebrew congregations were immigrants from the Caribbean, and Father Divine's peace mission had a mix of both. And the Nation of Islam was mostly Southern migrants. And so Garvey is part of it, and a sense of, well, that it was these immigrants and in the Garvey movement that a set of people first began to argue this. But, you know, one thing that people that I expected to find clearer connection to, or kind of the history of Jews of European descent in the Caribbean, right? So that Ford is from Barbados, seems like it would be important, but it's hard to draw that line directly. So I know that is a deep kind of backdrop. I read Laura Liebman's forthcoming book about mixed race Jews in the early Atlantic world. It occasionally, one of these figures might say something like, well, let me say this. They almost never say, we're Jewish because we encounter Judaism in the Caribbean. So and they don't invoke a kind of, maybe again, the kind of family history that Laura's book is looking at, of mixed race Jews. They always want to say we were Jewish in Africa, and that somehow we lost the ability to maintain those traditions in the Caribbean, and we're reclaiming them. And so but the question about Afro-Caribbean traditions, I think one thing Jacob Dorman writes about that I find interesting and didn't end up spending a lot of time on is the influence of Pentecostalism on a figure like Matthew, who, again, that church, the Commandment Keepers begins as a church. It's the Commandment Keepers Church of the Living God, the pillar and ground of truth. And there's a period in which you can see a kind of struggle. He's saying, you know, actually, this is not what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be this. And there are a bunch of early members who are Caribbean immigrants who leave, and as it becomes an Ethiopian Hebrew congregation, he's kind of reestablishing himself. But Dorman is interested in the influence of Pentecostalism. I hadn't thought about this actually in the context of writing the book, but Matthew does kind of, well, I'll say, I can't remember how I write about it exactly. Matthew's very interested in healing, and he writes or has written for him, it's unclear, I think he does himself, kind of formulae with maybe magical formulas that are meant to help heal his congregation. And I don't see explicitly, I think he would be unlikely to say, I'm carrying over some traditions of like African diasporic healing practices, but that might be in there as well. I hadn't thought about it in exactly that way before. So thanks for the question.
Yeah, it would be really interesting to look more at those. Okay, so there's two kind of overarching directions that I want to get to in the 5 minutes remaining, if possible. So one of them is thinking about actually taking up some of what we were just talking about in terms of chronology and origins, right? So some people are kind of wondering about Ethiopian Hebrews' understanding of the point at which they were Jewish and when they weren't, right, in history. And a little bit, some of those questions are related to ways in which Christians also see themselves as being Jewish, but the chronology is reversed, right? So for Christians, it's a supersessionism, it's we came later and replaced, but this is a kind of prior sense of being the true Jews. So is this something that they addressed? Did they relate specifically to Christianity? Did they talk much about their relationship to, to Jewish history in that way?
So if I get your question is about is a short and not very good version of it. What did they think? What did they have to say about Christianity after their embrace of Ethiopian Hebrew identity?
I think the question is, it's easy for some Jews to see this as another kind of appropriation.
Oh, I see.
Right.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
So if you're thinking about maybe it's appropriation, you think about some Christian appropriation of the idea of being a true Israel. So can it be compared to that? Did they differentiate themselves from that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the ways that these groups, that this generation of groups, and they still exist, and are one of the ways that they differ from the later groups, like the Black Hebrew Israelites, who have been in the news for violence, and or you might know them from street corners. Their claim is those other people who say they're Jews are not. They are not the Israelites. None of them. We are it. These are groups where the ones, again, I group under Ethiopian Hebrew. They are thinking about themselves in terms of, again, what Mira said earlier, a kind of brotherhood, that they are part of the larger community of Israelites, and they are trying to figure out what their history is within that. And so it's a narrative that is not one of displacement, but of engagement with. And there are lots of moments. Again, Jacob Dorman has a really nice article that is picks up in the late 50s, or the early 1950s, when Rabbi Matthew is trying to join the board of rabbis in New York, and Irving Bloch is an advocate of and supporter of these congregations in New York, and is working very hard in the 1940s and 1950s to get Jews of European descent in leadership in New York to accept them as part of a broader, under the umbrella of. And so I think that he tries to do that, and there are other figures engaged in that kind of work, is a recognition that these congregations see themselves in that way, right, as under this larger umbrella.
That's perfect. And actually, the second direction that I wanted to go, which we probably don't have time for, is people have been asking about the reactions of other Jews to these congregations. And so you did begin to answer that, right? That there were efforts within the Jewish world to incorporate and to connect.
There were some. Rabbi Matthew was not accepted into this group because of the nature of his ordination, and so that became a question for these connections in a kind of more official way. I think eventually he did become accepted, but so there were some, and then there was some rejection as well.
Amazing.
I need to step in, and Professor Weisenfeld, thank you so much for a really generative, fascinating presentation. I want to let everyone listening know that they can check the website not only for discussion questions as follow-up, but also we'll try to share some of the bibliography that was mentioned, including Professor Weisenfeld's most recent book. Thank you, everyone. Please remember that we are off next week. For those who are celebrating Passover, have a good and liberating holiday, and we look forward to being back with you in 2 weeks' time. Thanks so much.